Hello, and thank you for joining tonight's panel, Cultural Obstacles to Discussing Child Sexual Abuse. My name is Tania Haigh. I'm the co-founder and president of P.A.X.A, Parents Against Child Sex Abuse, and I'll be the moderator tonight. We're incredibly grateful to be partnering along with Doe Films for this big opportunity for a very important conversation. First, a little bit about me. I'm a proud parent. I'm a career marketer. I've been in my field for over 20 years. And prior to founding P.A.X.A, I was incredibly involved in the community and proud to be a past TEDx women organizer. And as life would have it, when one door closes, one opens. And child sexual abuse is a topic that has touched my life. And from that place, P.A.X.A was born in 2017. And in the work that we've been doing over the last 4 years as a nonprofit, we've been really staying close to the conversation when it comes to parents protecting children with respect to child sexual abuse. So when Allen v. Farrow went live earlier in the year, we were incredibly humbled, excited. So many emotions came over us because it was the first time we had seen in a long time a docuseries that not only highlighted the survivor's story and the journey, but really brought to the surface the parent conversation. And it's so important because we know that our kids go through a lot and parents are right alongside with them. And in the case of the Allen v. Farrow docuseries, watching Mia Farrow's courage, how she was navigating this incredibly traumatic experience is something that really helps deliver on the mission for P.A.X.A, which is to empower parents to protect their children from child sexual abuse. So not only is the mission for the nonprofit, it's also my personal passion to protect children and to also empower parents so they themselves are not blindsided by this epidemic, and that we're doing our collective work to protect children. So on that note, I would love to take this opportunity to introduce our terrific panel. I'd like to start out by saying that the cultural piece of this is very important to what we're bringing forward to round out all of these great webinars that have been put forth by the Allen v. Farrow team. Before we begin, I would like to say and make sure that we highlight that this conversation includes sexual abuse. It might be a disturbing topic to viewers, so please take good care while listening because we're really going to dig in and have an authentic conversation with all the panelists today. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First up is David Haigh, who is the co-founder and board director of P.A.X.A. Dave's direct experience with a close-in predator that impacted his family compelled him to learn more about grooming and child sexual abuse. As such, he's P.A.X.A's resident subject matter expert on predators and grooming. David is committed to making connections with dads so they are equipped to understand the prevalence of child sexual abuse and to keep an eye out on predator red flags. We're also thrilled to welcome Debra Suh, Esquire, has been the executive director of the Center for the Pacific Asian Family, otherwise known as CPAF, since 1999. CPAF is a nonprofit organization specializing in providing culturally grounded and linguistically responsive support to immigrants, limited English-speaking Asian and Pacific Islander survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Before joining CPAF, Debra worked as an attorney at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, where she established the Asian and Pacific Islander Legal Unit to increase low-income immigrant community access to legal services and representation. We'd also like for you to help us welcome Aishah Shahidah Simmons, who is the creator of the 2006 groundbreaking Ford Foundation-funded film, No, the Rape Documentary, and the editor of the 2020 Lambda Literary Award-winning anthology, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse. Aishah's lived experience as a survivor of childhood and adult sexual violence, a Black feminist lesbian, and a long-term Buddhist practitioner informed the creation of her work. Presently, she is a Soros Media Fellow. Please also help us welcome Tara Walker Lyons, who's a proud Pikuni Blackfeet from Montana's Bitterroot Valley. She's a passionate and dedicated activist and an Indigenous leader giving voice to painful issues relating to her tribe and beyond, including child sexual abuse and missing and murdered Indigenous people. As a survivor of chronic childhood trauma, Tara has worked to reform Montana's statute of limitations and created the country's first Sexual Assault Survivors Day, which is observed in Montana on the first Tuesday of April annually. She also worked to pass Tara's Law in 2017, which is aimed towards educating children in Montana's schools about safety and sexual abuse prevention. Tara was P.A.X.A's Parent of the Year in 2020, the same year her TEDx talk on surviving trauma was released and garnered over 50,000 views worldwide. Great, welcome everybody. I think I got all of us. I'm very excited to be having this very important conversation. And I want to make sure before we kick off that this is meant to educate, empower, and inform all of our viewers. And hopefully everyone's going to walk away with learning something new about the different cultures today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully many of you or most of you have already had the pleasure of watching episode 1 of the Alan v. Farrow series. And we highly encourage you that after tonight, you go and watch the rest of the series on HBO Max, because it's truly a remarkably executed docuseries that continues to educate all of us in so many aspects of child sexual abuse. So we know that this series illuminates the experience of a child sex abuse survivor, describing and realizing how they were groomed to endure their abuse, and the experience of a protective parent noticing warning signs of abuse, but doubting their significance due to the amount of trust they had in their partner. So I really wanted to begin by opening these points up to the panel. Have either of you dealt with these issues in your personal life, either as a survivor or a parent? And I'd love for Tara Walker Lyons to kick us off.
Thank you so much. I think that while watching Alan v. Farrow, it becomes very apparent that Mia, the mother in the docuseries, is very passionate about being a mother. And when you're a mom, you want to do everything the right way. But when you're being groomed, it becomes really cloudy what the right way is. In my story, it was my mother's partner who sexually abused me. And I think that one of the underlying things that affects my culture as a Native American is poverty. Grooming and poverty can go hand in hand, because my mother never would have been able to live without the support of my stepfather. And so poverty is an underlying factor for a lot of Native Americans. I think that Dylan Farrow says something rather profound later on in the film. She mentions that she has spoken to a lot of other child survivors, and one common theme that she hears is that, well, my mom didn't support me. And she says that she feels lucky that her mom, Mia, supported her. And I felt very impacted by that, because unfortunately my mom did not support me. In my story, I actually ended my abuse by running from my house in the middle of the night with my best friend. And we ran from my home to the only police officer in our town. We ran to his house in the middle of the night. And that night, when the police officer had to try to find out where I was going to go, he spoke with my mom on the phone, and she said that she was going to be supporting my stepfather. And I think that was probably the most painful part about my story, was my mom not supporting me. And now that I'm an adult, I can see that these grooming patterns really affected her decision. And as I mentioned, poverty really played a big part in that.
Thanks, Tara. Is there anybody else that'd like to weigh in?
I think Tara hit on a really important note, that the grooming sometimes isn't always just a positive grooming. It's actually, in a lot of cases of domestic violence, it's coercive control. Oftentimes the abusive person is conditioning the non-offending parent to become more dependent on them, to make sure that they don't have good social protective networks. They are really, in a way, making them distrust themselves. They lose their self-esteem, and they distrust their own judgment sometimes because of this coercive control that is exercised over them. And over time, just the chipping away at their ability to make good decisions is impacted. So I think that one of the things that we have to really think about is just the grooming component. It's not always just giving positive rewards. It's also oftentimes, very sinister, coercive ways of really pushing who could be a protective parent down.
I have something that I would like to add as well on this topic. I think that it's oftentimes much more difficult to see signs of abuse in your own circumstances. I can speak about that from a personal basis, but also as one of the co-founders of P.A.X.A, that's one of the reasons we put such an emphasis on the importance of recognizing red flag behavior. The fact of the matter is that predators oftentimes, in order to get access to children, have to position themselves as the type of person who would never do something like that. And so what we like to do is we like to make sure that we educate folks to look for red flags, because it's very difficult to see it when you know someone and you trust someone. I think that's what's so important about having this docuseries out there in the public, because it makes all of us stop, pause, and look at ourselves and look at our tight-end community and see if we can notice any of the red flag behaviors that we see from predators. And I just think it's a really difficult thing to see in your own life unless you're educated a little bit about what to look for.
I'd like to jump in as a survivor who was abused by my step-grandfather, and my parents worked. They did a lot of human rights, international human rights work. So my grandparents provided home for me while my parents were on the road, and I think that there's the grooming aspect, and then there's also the critical importance of believing children, because I told when I was what was happening, and I wasn't believed. And I don't, since there's been a lot of work this happened in the 70s, and since that time, my mother's written about her not believing in protecting me as a child. But I really think that there is a grooming. In hindsight, there was definitely, I think, on some level, a grooming process, but I also think that there weren't a lot of visible signs, but I did tell. And I think that we tend not to believe children. And I think that it's really important. And that's what I really appreciated about the docuseries, was like that Mia believed, that when, even if it's like incredulous, or we really like the person or trust the person, that our first instinct should always be to believe the child, to let the child know that you believe them and that you're there for them, and that you're going to, and then if you have doubt or whatever, that you find out, but you always let the child know that you believe them.
Aishah, I'm going to build on this, because this whole concept of believing your child is so central to the work that we do as a nonprofit when we're talking to parents and educating parents, because the next question is about the misconceptions that the general public might have regarding child sexual abuse. And one of them is that children lie, or that they're making this up. It's like so hard to believe, right? So not only is it hard to believe that the child could be saying such a thing, but it could be so hard to quote unquote believe that someone that you absolutely trusted with your child, the people that might have been on that will to take over your child, the people that you just absolutely trust the most with your child could possibly do this to a child or your own child. So on that note, I want to build on this concept of, what are some other misconceptions about child sexual abuse? And I would say, in addition to the building on Aishah's point, I would say one that is, really dear to me is this misconception that it could never happen to my child. It's not my child. It's not going to happen to my child because I'm a protective parent. It's not going to, it's not the kids on my block because I live in this, fancy type of neighborhood. And the list goes on and on and on. People are not recognizing how prevalent this really is, how often it's really happening, how it's happening in these very small, discrete spaces. Or as I like to say sometimes when I'm doing interviews, it's happening under our noses. So who else would love to build on, what other misconceptions are out there, with regard to the nature of child sexual abuse? Go ahead, Tara.
Yeah, I think that something that is overlooked a lot is other children are often perpetrators in sexual abuse. We tend to look at children as just completely innocent all the time, but we don't know what someone else's child has been introduced to. And so I think that in this day and age, more people are waking up to the fact that, you know, sleepovers aren't really the safest decision, at least for my family. And other children can be a danger in terms of sexual abuse. And so I think that's also a misconception. And I know that in my work as an activist and an advocate, I know that victims who are sexually abused by, say, an older sibling or their cousin, sometimes they feel like their story is invalid or isn't as valid as victims of adults. Because they were sexually abused by another child. And so I just wanted to speak up on that point in terms of being a misconception that other children can also be perpetrators of sexual abuse. And it's just really important to really realize that fact. And as I mentioned, in my family, sleepovers are just not on the table. They're unquestionably just not a thing that we do. Because I know how unsafe it can be. And on Aishah's point, believing a child, even if this child is saying, well, my cousin did something to me, it's so important to take that at face value and take it seriously, because it can change a survivor's entire trajectory in terms of healing if you believe them right from the get-go. So that's just one thing I wanted to mention.
I was
Great.
saying it.
Oops, sorry, Debra. The only thing I wanted to add to just contextualize Tara's feedback would be that the data point that we've seen is 40% of child sexual abuse is from a child to a child. So I just wanted to add that to give folks kind of how to quantify where it fits. Go ahead, Debra.
I just wanted to also add that we oftentimes think of sexual abuse survivors to be girls and women, and one in 6 boys are sexually abused before they're 18. So I have a daughter and a son, so I gave them both the same education and to learn about the issues and all the statistics, because it's happening to our boys as well as girls. But the one thing that I think for me, the biggest change in how I view child sexual abuse is the fact that I went from really a point of looking at this as an individual responsibility to protect their own children to really being a community issue, that this is a collective responsibility to keep all of our children safe. And to do that, we have to look at the underlying problems and issues that really prevent from people being able to protect their children. The number one thing that we see over and over again is when parents, usually mothers, who speak out against an abusive partner who is sexually abusing their children, they might lose their custody of the children. So that's a big barrier that we have to address. Sometimes not even to the other partner, sometimes to foster care. They're unable to keep their children when they speak out. So that's a big barrier that we have to really address. Another thing that we have to think about are other institutional barriers. Like, we work with immigrant survivors, and for them, the lack of knowledge about what protective systems are there, their inability to speak English proficiently, to be able to access those services, and to navigate this massively complex system is really a huge barrier in being able to protect their children. So we have to really look at this not only as an individual responsibility, and of course parents do have responsibility to protect their children, but we also have to look at the societal or community response and what are our responsibilities to really support the whole entire child and the protective parent.
Yeah, I wanted to also just continue building and say that not only it's very important to remember that, you know, childhood sexual abuse happens to all children, and also that the harm doers are not only men or masculine folks, that they are also women, that women also cause harm, sexual harm to children. And also that then we're in terms of speaking as a member of the LGBTQ community, it's important to also remember that non-binary children are at high rates of childhood sexual abuse. And really also like looking at what happens in terms of children who commit harm, sexual harm against other children, that so often many of them have also been harmed. So how do we hold that? Like for me personally, I look at that, it definitely, they need to be held accountable, but it's also, I don't look at that as the same as an adult for me personally. And so that so often we, a lot of behavior. I don't believe that we come to this planet, that we arrive here as harm doers. I don't believe that. I believe it's learned behavior. So my question is, particularly when children are committing harm against other children, where did they learn this behavior? Where did it, you know, how did it start? And that kind of piggybacks or builds on what Debra's talking about in terms of that community responsibility, community responses, in terms of really looking at, you know, not looking at each case as an individual incident, but just kind of seeing patterns in trauma that's happening and then played out and repeated and replicated.
I'm really happy that we're already bringing up the theme of community, because it's really laying the foundation for the rest of our conversation tonight. So on that note, I want to really get into this concept of grooming and how, you know, we know grooming is obviously that pathway to abusing a child. But what some folks may not realize is that there's a lot more involved in the grooming process beyond the child. Few people may be aware that, you know, parents, the other adults around the child, and the community and beyond can get groomed to make sure, as Dave had mentioned earlier, that, you know, the predator positions himself or himself is not the person that would do that type of a thing. So on that note, Dave, I'd love for you to kind of walk us through, you know, what does this look like and how does this happen? How do predators go on their grooming path beyond a child?
Yeah. In a lot of the conversations that we've had at P.A.X.A. and some of the white papers that we've read and some of the research, I think the most illuminating thing that I looked at personally were some of the statements from folks who are currently incarcerated who had been convicted of child sex abuse. And at first it's jarring and it's awful to read, and it's quote unquote unbelievable, right? Because you're listening to people talk about how they were able to get access to children. But when you kind of stop and think about it, it was all very obvious. And if you put a nefarious hat on yourself and said, if this was something one wanted to do, how would one do it? Well, you know, you would probably start looking for the most vulnerable type of victims, right? You would probably try to find someone who might have some family situations that you could exploit. Poverty and particularly single parents are often sought out by folks who are predators to specifically get access to their children. Oftentimes, we as a society have a very difficult time acknowledging that the exterior, the outside signs of someone does not necessarily betray what's inside of them. So if we were to meet a nice young man in his 20s who really wanted to get involved with the school choir, we would all think, what a nice person. Look at this person. He's trying to help children. I think the challenge that we face as a society is, wow, I really hope this is a really nice person who's looking to help children. However, this is something that we need to pay particular attention to, because this is someone in their 20s who's volunteering with children and attempting to spend as much time as possible with children. Hey, they could be the nicest person in the world, and we certainly hope that's the case. However, this is something that we want to monitor and just make sure that everyone's following the rules that we have in place, such as you're not allowed to take a kid and take him into the back room without anyone else present and things like that. I feel like when you read these stories of how predators were able to get access to children, it was because there weren't enough people in the culture of the church, perhaps the school, perhaps whatever organization you're talking about, that didn't have enough skepticism towards the intentions of people who are looking to have access to children. And so I think that kind of couples on some of the things we were saying, is that it takes a village, or it's a community. There's not any necessary connection between an individual and what you see on the outside, and what they might be thinking or attempting to do. So that's kind of what I think in terms of some of the grooming tactics. Nothing's really overly complex, but it's very difficult to see when it's happening right in front of you.
Would anyone be able to add a little bit more about, so thank you, David, anything more about how, what are some of the tactics that a predator might be using to groom the community or beyond the child or the immediate family? Any perspective from, any of the survivors on the panel, or just as parents where might have impacted you? Yeah, Tara, go ahead.
Yeah, in the Native American community, there have been a lot of outside organizations that have influenced our culture in a negative way. And in terms of my tribe, the Blackfeet, one of those entities has been the Catholic Church. For instance, there was a lawsuit that was brought against the Catholic Church for all of the different Native American victims who sued the Catholic Church because they were sexually abused at missionary school or at the schools that they went to through the church. And so I had the opportunity to meet a couple of these victims, and many of these victims said that their parents didn't believe them because they believed that their priest was connected to God, and there would just be no way that this would happen because this priest was holy to them. And so they would put their beliefs in their religion above believing their children. And in the Blackfeet community, this has created a trickle-down effect because, as we do know, some victims of sexual abuse do grow up to also mimic that behavior that they endured and become abusers. And so in our tribe, historically, sexual abuse didn't used to be a thing before colonialism. Children and women were regarded as things to be treasured. And then this outside source came in, colonialism, the Catholic Church, and disrupted that. And so I think that religious beliefs and religious entities have this really special way of permeating people's minds into thinking that sexual abuse is just not possible because they're connected to God. And it's especially tragic for the Native American community because these families can be ripped apart. When a child speaks up about sexual abuse and they're not believed, it's not only is poverty an issue, but these families are so tightly knit, and many times they live 10, 15 people to one house. It creates such a disruption that it's really profound. And so I just wanted to speak on that because the religious aspect in regards to Native American communities is just really heavy, especially with sexual abuse.
Thanks, Sarah. I think this is a terrific way to weave all these things that we're trying to talk about today. That leads us to really more extensive dialogue around culture and our respective ethnicity and races, and how, all either within our own culture or race, we have influences around child sexual abuse and how that impacts us personally, the survivor, and then also the external factors of our community, right? Just the way that you described it. So on that note, I'd love to ask if Aishah could help us, talk a little bit more about what are some of the obstacles in your specific culture when it comes to child sexual abuse.
Yes, well, Thank you. And, you know, it's always so hard to speak on behalf of millions of people. But I will say in my anthology, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse, which features the voices of 40 diasporic Black survivors, advocates, who really are not only disclosing and sharing what happened to them as children, but also envisioning how we can disrupt and end this pandemic, and specifically without relying on the carceral state. And so from one of the things that I think is very prevalent is that for centuries, you know, Black people in this country have been engaged with the racial outsider causing harm to our communities. And so we're and then contemporarily we're often barraged with just, you know, so many news stories around police killings and, you know, and other forms of violence committed against communities by the state. So when you hold that reality, then it makes it very hard to trust in a system where that hasn't protected, you know, the community. And then how do you, in the name of protection from white supremacy, from police violence, I think that we tend to not know what to do with the insiders causing harm from within. We tend to kind of think like, well, what happens in the family stays in the family. We're going to handle it within the family, which unfortunately has often meant not dealing with it, that survivors are often left to healing their wounds alone. And so I think that is very prevalent. And for me, I really think not only, I mean, definitely within, speaking as an African-American woman, but and as a human who's also an African-American woman, I just think it's really important that we actually imagine, like, what if we all thought that committing any form of sexual violence against children or even and adults was unthinkable, like just not okay. Like if the reality diviners such as pastors, judges, imams, rabbis, babalaos, you know, educators, if all of us really thought that it was not okay to harm children, that then I think rather than demonizing children who are acting out, so often, that's the other thing I wanted to just share, is like so often when that we see a lot of adultification of Black children, specifically the sexual exploitation of girls, we don't see them as children. We just kind of, oh, they're being fast, that's the language. Or in terms of boys who are acting out, that we don't see like, hey, maybe something is going on that's causing harm. And instead, we as society tends to like see them as criminals. And so I think that what the challenges that face is really seeing our humanity, seeing our vulnerability, and applying compassion and empathy to the crimes that are happening, and also thinking outside of a box that just is like lock them up and throw away the keys. Because speaking as somebody who was, my parents didn't harm me, they were bystanders. It's not only just the person who harms, who actually commits the act, it is the entire, there's a whole bystander phenomena. We can't lock up everybody. Even if we wanted to, we can't. So we have to think about how can we disrupt and end this pandemic in humane ways? How can we do it without causing further harm and centering the most harm?
Debra, can you give us perspective on the communities that you're representing tonight?
Sure. Aishah spoke about a very important point, that because of the solutions that we have right now is so drastic and carceral, that there are a lot of communities that don't want to speak up, and seeing that is the only option that's out there right now. So I think that I agree that we have to come up with community solutions that really address protecting children in ways that are also supporting our communities. That's really important. And I'll just put another caveat there. For Asian Americans, we are an incredibly diverse community as well, with different languages, different cultures, different immigration histories. So I come with, and for every person that we are helping at CPAF who are sexual assault survivors, child sexual assault survivors, there are thousands of cases we're not seeing. So I come with limited understanding. So But given that, there's definitely the vast majority of child sexual abuse cases that we do see have happened years and years ago and are coming, and the survivors are coming to us when they're adults, talking about what happened to them when they were children because something either triggered them or they were re-traumatized. So there's definitely a lot of silence around the issue of child sexual abuse. Part of it, like Aishah said, there aren't very good responses and solutions to, you know, folks who do come out and talk about it. And there's also just so much complexity, cultural complexities that come with it. So one thing I can talk about is for Asian American community, we're the least likely to talk about sex and sexuality to anybody. Our children are the least likely to talk about it with adults. I remember, like, I went to a UCLA class and there were about 60 people in the group. And I asked, like, and this was like 2 years ago, I asked, how many have you talked about sex or sexuality with your parents? There were no hands out of a whole entire UCLA class. We're not talking about it. And part of that is there's just a lot of hesitancy to talk about sex and sexuality. And also some of the ways that really galvanize some of the issues in the countries of origin didn't actually impact the people who immigrated. There's this thing called cultural freeze. So for example, when Korean immigrants immigrated to US, let's say before 2011, they really didn't address child sexual assault until then. And there were instances of sexual assault, but you know, very public instances, but nothing happened to the perpetrators. It wasn't until this movie came out called Silenced in 2011, and the whole nation was galvanized and they did away with statute of limitations for sexual assault for children and disabled folks. So that was like the turning point where people started paying attention and started listening to kids. But if you immigrated before then, you weren't part of that process of being galvanized. So you're kind of still stuck in that culture of pre-2011 when children were really not taught about boundaries or taught about being able to speak out and get help. So that's definitely an impact on how we are seeking help, how we are working through some of our community issues right now. And then I would say that the one really big factor that maybe people don't think about are the institutional barriers to speaking out and being silenced. And part of that is the Asian Pacific Islander community is an immigrant community, and oftentimes there are complex immigration consequences to speaking out as well. So that person that you want to speak out against is not just a family member. They could be your sponsor to help you come to the United States. They could be the employer who sponsored you to be working in the United States. So you're not just speaking out against an employer, you're speaking out against someone who is allowing you to stay in the United States. So there are a lot of complicated issues for the API community that we have to really be thinking about as well, on why they're being silenced.
Thanks, Debra. And I would say I'm going to put on my Latina hat because that wasn't part of my introduction, but I'm bicultural and identify as Latina. I'm of Honduran background, and a lot of the themes that Debra, you just shared around immigration really spill into the Hispanic culture as well, and what Latinos are dealing with here in the United States. And as Latinos, we come from such different perspectives, not only from the different countries that funnel into the US, or how long we've been in the US, or generations of families have been here, or if you're just getting here as an immigrant, we've got such range of issues that overlay to our Hispanic culture. The immigration fears, absolutely, just like how you described them, are very relevant to what Latinos face here in the United States. And also, I would say this concept of silence is also very akin to what happens in the Asian community. It's very taboo to talk about sex. There's still issues within teens wanting to get birth control, God forbid, talking about something that you might out a family member on. And then the last piece I would say in terms of common themes or commonalities is what Aishah shared about the African community, where African-American community, Latinos are also very much raised to say whatever happens in our family or in this house, I want to say it to you all in Spanish, but I'll just stick with English, is it stays in the house. So all these these barriers really limit the ability for this to be any kind of topic that a child would want to come forward about, let alone have a mom be a protective mom like Mia Farrow. So many moms are not in that position to be able to do that because they're weighing, just like what Tara talked about with her situation. My mom came to this country on a visa with my stepdad. Nothing happened there, but just I understand those dynamics are very real in talking about like the financial aspect of a family's dynamic that could or could not empower a protective mom to speak forward or take those bold moves to be, alongside the child. So I know I specifically appreciated hearing more from that mom perspective that Mia took on, because we want to empower more of those courageous moves on behalf of children. And I know that we're kind of soon coming up to the end of our conversation here. I would love to talk about, to give Dave an opportunity to kind of help close us out here in terms of, we've talked a lot about, the grooming process of child sexual abuse, why it can be so hard to believe, some of those misconceptions. Dave, can you help us and the audience understand, like, where do we go from here in terms of keeping the subject top of mind, being something that is okay to talk about in the spirit of, protecting children?
The fact we're having this conversation is a fantastic thing. The fact that everyone's sharing a unique story helps us in an era of just absolute chaos and division and hating everyone and all these other things. There's something really quite lovely about seeing kind of thematic congruence amongst different folks from different backgrounds. I think that's a really good thing to see. This is something that affects everyone. And by seeing more unique voices, we're able to kind of empathize and feel it and understand. Whereas sometimes, when there's a news headline, and you see, oh, the Catholic Church, you go, well, I'm not Catholic. And then you go, oh, R. Kelly, and you go, oh yeah, but I mean, I'm not an R&B fan, whatever. And, gymnastics, oh, that's not me. Oh, football team, Jerry Sandusky. Oh, my kid doesn't play football. But like in aggregate, when we all kind of share our stories, you realize like, wow, it's everywhere. This is something that we all need to pay attention to. So I feel like this type of conversation helps us all connect with that a little bit better. So on that note, Tania asked me what I think the moving forward kind of concluding statements from me are, and I really think that it's important that we, I believe it was Aishah that said we can't throw everyone in jail, right? We can't just penalize people. We need to try to find a way to increase cultural awareness on this issue. And we can look for red flags and say, and have a little bit of courage. Hey, excuse me, soccer coach, I'd rather you not, put your hands on the shoulders of the players. That's just not what we deem acceptable. Fist bump's fine. That type of thing isn't very natural for me to want to say. Before I learned more about this, it would be something where, oh, I don't want to accuse someone of that. I mean, it was just fine. I'm sure everything's fine. And I feel like if we can change the cultural component around it, where we call out things that we deem to be unacceptable, I think that will help all of us and result in fewer victims who will then, there's a huge echo effect on that. The bystander thing also that Aishah spoke of, I think is of critical importance. So that's what I think.
I think, David, you hit on something really important, that we all need play a role in ending child sexual abuse. That oftentimes we're a little bit scared to do something and we feel like we don't have the expertise. But I think all of us, every individual, have the ability to be a safe person, to listen and believe children when they raise issues, and to introduce them to resources, introduce them in the safe adult in their life to resources that can help them. And I would just challenge all members of organizations that are watching this to make sure that you are not, there's no wrong door, that you are aware about this issue. I love the series. I think it really helps educate us of all the different complexities of child sexual abuse. So if we can all watch it and be educated so that we can make sure that when you spot something, you do something, and you're able to provide them with not just a phone number, a referral, but a warm handoff, because oftentimes it's really hard to call the right place. So if you can do a warm handoff, help them call, make that call, that will go a long ways to making sure that they get the help they need.
I just really want to say how important it is to, I think that there are various levels of childhood sexual abuse, and I think one of the toughest forms, and they're all hard, is when it's happening in the family. And so I just really think that that's really like what's going on. Like, not that it's easy if it's the priest or if it's the soccer coach or the pastor or whatever, but then there's something about really being, it's a whole nother level to tell the uncle, you know what, I don't think that she or he should sit in your lap like that, like, so that we have to like really, I think about that in terms of as we, and that's what I believe this series offers in terms of what's happening in the family with parental or grandparental or uncles and aunts, in terms of just those nuances, those difficulties, that to have those hard conversations. I believe at the end of the day, my parents believed me, but they didn't know what to do. I mean, this was in the 70s, but they still didn't know what to do. And so I think that we have to create more spaces to really talk about what's happening in the family.
Thanks, Aishah. Before we wrap, does anybody else have anything else that they want to contribute as like parting words for our audience? Oh my gosh, I was expecting a lot more. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all so much for this terrific conversation tonight. And for all of you watching, we really hope that you took away some really terrific insights about how child sexual abuse cuts across all different cultures, demographics, races, ethnicities, communities, and how we all need to work together to solve for this critical epidemic that's touching the children's lives, and how moving forward we can take all of our collective experiences to make it a better place, a better process for child survivors, a better place for parents who are going through this alongside their children. Certainly that is what P.A.X.A is all about, is what we're really trying to help make sure that parents aren't blindsided by child sexual abuse. They have these cues on knowing how to believe their child, was so pivotal to the healing process. But last but not least, I want to say a huge thank you to Doe Films and the team that helped us make this panel possible, to give us this forum through their channels where everyone can go view afterwards on YouTube and Facebook. Jane Doe Films has done a terrific job on bringing visibility to really difficult topics. And Alan V. Farrow took a lot of work. If you haven't watched it, please do, because it really brings so much context to all the layers and aspects and the dimensions of child sexual abuse in a way that we have not seen before. And we think that there's such tremendous value in the power of film and documentary to bring more awareness to this topic, to create these types of forums. So on that note, for those of you who want more information about all of the panelists tonight, please visit the event page. There are also additional resources on alanvfarrowseries.com/take-action. Thank you again for joining us, and please share all of this among your audiences so we can continue to drive change. Thank you.